If you've ever stepped foot in a language classroom, you already know that how we learn a language completely shapes how we experience the world. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tracing a really fascinating journey. We're going to look at the evolution of English language teaching methods. We'll be going all the way from the strict, rule-heavy classrooms of the past right up to the dynamic, AI-powered digital environments we see today. Seriously, why do we study a language for years, memorizing every obscure grammar rule, but then completely freeze up when we have to actually order a coffee from a real human being? It's incredibly frustrating, right? Well, the answer to this mystery actually isn't about your intelligence, not at all. It's deeply rooted in exactly how you were taught. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The traditional roots. 2. The communicative shift. 3. The digital revolution. 4. Blended and flipped learning. And finally, 5. Choosing your teaching method. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the traditional roots. You see, teaching models have constantly had to adapt to the needs of their specific eras. Looking back at the 19th century, grammar translation was the go-to, primarily used for analyzing classical literature. But as the world modernized and people actually needed to use language for trade and daily interaction, things had to shift. So we saw the direct method pop up in the late 19th century, then the structural approach in the 1930s, and finally, the military-driven audiolingual method during the World War II era. Let's look a little closer at the grammar translation method, or GTM. This was heavily rooted in how classical Greek and Latin were taught, basically treating language learning like an intense intellectual puzzle. Now, it was absolutely fantastic if you wanted to translate a passage from an ancient text, or, analyze subject-verb agreement in a Shakespearean sonnet. It built a rock-solid understanding of grammar structures. But there was a massive catch here. It practically ignored speaking and listening skills entirely, which left students completely unprepared to have an actual real-life conversation. So that severe lack of conversational ability, it actually sparked a bit of a rebellion in the late 19th century called the direct method. Brought into the spotlight by schools like Berlitz, this method completely banned translating into the native language. No translation allowed. Instead, teachers used physical objects, what educators call realia, and visual aids to totally immerse their students. Imagine a teacher holding up an object and just saying, "The pen is under the book," forcing the students to associate meaning directly with the target language. It was a game changer for fluency for sure, but it definitely required highly fluent teachers, and it really struggled when it came to teaching abstract vocabulary. Then, the Second World War hit. Suddenly, armies needed troops to learn foreign languages rapidly and with high accuracy. Enter the audiolingual method. Based on behaviorist psychology, this approach essentially treated language like habit formation. It relied heavily on intense repetition, mimicry, and endless structural drills. So if a teacher said, "He goes to school," the student was drilled to instantly transform it to, "Does he go to school?" And while it definitely improved pronunciation and accuracy, its highly mechanical nature left almost zero room for creative expression. Students basically became incredibly accurate but rigid grammar robots. Moving on to Section 2, the communicative shift. By the time the 1970s rolled around, educators had this massive collective realization which resulted in a really stark paradigm shift. The old obsession with perfect form and total accuracy, which was the hallmark of the grammar translation era, was completely replaced by a new priority: real-world meaning and fluency. Educators finally acknowledged that, hey, it's actually perfectly okay to make a few grammatical errors as long as you're successfully negotiating meaning and getting your actual point across. This brand new philosophy was called Communicative Language Teaching, or CLT, and it was a completely learner-centered approach. Instead of sitting there memorizing bilingual word lists, students were suddenly doing real-life tasks. They were role-playing a hotel check-in, doing these information gap activities where, say, one student has a train schedule and the other has to ask questions to plan a trip, or even debating complex social issues. This was brilliant because it integrated listening, speaking, reading, and writing all at once by forcing students to use the language authentically. Which brings us to Section 3, the digital revolution. Moving into the post-2000 era, things get really interesting. Modern educators aren't just using tech as a fancy whiteboard anymore. They're using it for deep, AI-assisted peer collaboration. Today, students can use tools like ChatGPT or Pseudowrite to co-write and refine creative grammar scripts. Or they can use Descript's AI transcription to actually produce and edit their own English language podcasts. In a debate setting, they can use Perplexity.ai to live fact-check claims exactly as they happen. Meanwhile, platforms like Canva allow them to design brilliant visual vocabulary boards. It literally transforms the classroom into a highly creative, collaborative hub. Now, we do have to talk about the tech trade-off because it is very real. While digital tools and AI offer incredible benefits like self-paced learning and highly personalized feedback, they do come with substantial risks. Relying too heavily on this infrastructure risks widening the digital divide for students who just don't have stable internet access. Plus, there's the very real threat of screen fatigue. Heavy tech use can sometimes isolate learners, stripping away that invaluable face-to-face spontaneity that makes learning a language so deeply human in the first place. Let's look at how we solve for that in Section 4, Blended and Flipped Learning. Because of those very real tech trade-offs we just talked about, educators had to figure out how to perfectly balance the digital with the physical. Enter the flipped classroom, which cleanly reverses the traditional educational model to do exactly that. Here's how it works. At home, students consume the theoretical content, like watching a recorded grammar video or reading up on the theory. Because they've already absorbed that passive lecture on their own time, precious classroom time is entirely freed up for active, collaborative learning. Think debates, peer tests, and role-playing. It really maximizes the presence of the human teacher for actual, meaningful communication. But implementing this definitely takes care. As highlighted by guidelines from the Columbia Center for Teaching and Learning, educators must strictly avoid what they call the course and a half phenomenon. This is a super important warning to keep in mind. Basically, it means you can't just pile a bunch of new online asynchronous assignments on top of a full traditional face-to-face workload. If those digital tools aren't intentionally and seamlessly integrated right into the syllabus, it just leads to massive student burnout. And that intentional integration we just mentioned, that's the very definition of blended learning. It's the thoughtful mixing of online digital media, which is asynchronous, with traditional synchronous face-to-face instruction. When it's done right, it's a highly flexible model that can be totally customized to individual learner needs. It's fantastic because it supports different learning styles everywhere, from secondary school right up through adult education. It just balances structure with independence beautifully. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, Choosing Your Teaching Method. So, with all this history and all these amazing tools at our disposal, finding the absolute best framework depends entirely on your specific objectives and your learners' proficiency levels. For example, if your students are beginners who really need a strong structural foundation, elements of the traditional grammar translation method still hold a lot of value for those A1 to B1 levels. Now, if you're aiming for real-life fluency across a wider range of levels, say A1 to C1, communicative language teaching is absolutely your engine. And if you really want to drive deep engagement and active learning with more advanced learners, A2 all the way up to C2, the flipped and blended models are incredibly powerful. The big takeaway here isn't about finding one single perfect method. It's about choosing the right tool for the job. All of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final question. Will AI eventually replace language teachers, or will it just make them better? We've seen teaching methods constantly evolved, right? From rote translation all the way to AI-generated scripts. But at the absolute heart of language is human connection. As our tools become increasingly automated, the irreplaceable role of human facilitation, guiding nuance, building a student's confidence, and negotiating real meaning, honestly, seems more vital than ever. So, what do you think?